Returning the Names project has been in existence for 15 years, and every year we see new issues emerging around this project. We hear these questions from all kinds of sides. We hear them in the lines on the social media. We hear them under other circumstances, for example, in connection with the Last Address project. And I would like to remind you that when in 2018 the memorial law at the former Komunarka killing field site was opened, it was a paradoxical situation because before that relatives of the killed people had fought hard for the wall to be erected there, but there was no money, no will. And then relatives decided to chip in and had a small monument erected stating that so many people lie there. And a quote from Akhmatova, I would like to name everybody by name. In 2018, it seemed that everybody was named by name, but that was not the case. Not the right people were named by name. So what is to be done? What can we do with our lists? So we want to name everybody, but those named are not the right ones. And a lot of people on the lists, a lot of victims who were in fact executed, but before their execution they had committed a lot of crimes themselves, and they turned out to be rehabilitated at the end of the day. And there are some other people who did slightly less than they, but were not rehabilitated. What can we do about the Secret Service agents? Shall we take them out of the database? Complicated issue. I remember the controversy back then, and opinions divided, truly divided, and debates were so heated that I was taken aback. I couldn't understand the heat of the debate. And from the historic standpoint, we became hostages of the Soviet authorities' actions because the first rehabilitation acts date back to Khrushchev's times, right after Stalin's death. And what is to be done? Because the Soviet authorities had their own criteria of rehabilitation, and rehabilitation back then, unlike what happened later in Yeltsin's times, it was based on the court decision. So quasi-judicial bodies' decisions and court decisions were overturned by courts, not by prosecutors, in accordance with the law on rehabilitation. But people mix two things, I think. Veneration, glorification with communication, information, because we're talking about the victims of political repressions, people who were sentenced, who were convicted wrongfully because the quasi-judicial bodies do not fit into the constitutional order of the Soviet Union, and they were convicted under false pretenses, wrongfully. So they need to be rehabilitated. The Soviet authorities under Khrushchev acted in very straightforward manner. We rehabilitate those of our own and not the others. And it became clear that Kamenev, Zinoviev, or Bukharin or Rykov, they were falsely accused, sentenced, but the Soviet authorities were in a hurry to exonerate them because it was a pantheon of Stalin's victims and pantheon of Stalin's heroes, and those who should not be venerated. And there is an afterthought, a misconception that if you rehabilitate somebody, you glorify them. It still remains. When you rehabilitate somebody, people still believe that means that the person is a good one, hasn't committed anything bad. Of course, it's a very humanistic approach, but it's a wrong approach. And rehabilitation, it means only one thing, that this person fell a victim of political repressions, who was wrongfully accused, wrongfully sentenced, was executed or thrown in prison unlawfully. No more than, no less. It did not look into its past or his past actions. And when rehabilitation takes place, a court's decision is overturned with regard to a specific case, specific person. Say, if somebody is accused that he was a British spy, yes, he was executed because of that, and became clear later then it was false, and that person needs to be rehabilitated. But when we look at the high-ranking Secret Service officer, there is no mentioning that before his execution he had committed crimes himself, that he had trampled on the rules of and norms. Yes, that he was part of, they organized the repressions. Yes, that he organized the repressions, or he was involved in the horrendous collective collectivization process geared against the peasantry. So if we keep telling that rehabilitation does not mean glorification, I think with time it would yield fruits. Well, I have a question in this regard. The returning the names project, and there are some technical principles on rehabilitation. Among the rehabilitated people, we can find those uh, whose names people don't want to read out at the Solovetsky Stone. There are other people who haven't been rehabilitated, but people want to read their names out at the Solovetsky Stone. And what are the mechanisms? What are the tools? Can we, as organizers of this project, use these tools in order to make a decision? Well, our rehabilitation law states that we cannot rehabilitate, and we agree with that. It cannot rehabilitate those people who committed crimes against justice. All Secret Service agents committed crimes against justice, all the high-ranking communist officials, prosecutors, judges, because they did violate rules of law. So there's there's a clear answer. Yes, under the law on rehabilitation, those who had committed crimes against justice, they are not to be rehabilitated. We can single those people out. We have a clear understanding that they are not subject to rehabilitation. But this law also contains some items which we cannot agree with right away. Clearly, those people who committed war crimes, that's a clear-cut case. What about traitors of homeland or so-called spies? It's quite dubious because the Soviet authorities called many people spies. What about members of national resistance movements? All kinds of rebels, insurgents who fought against the Soviet state. Yes, the law on rehabilitation states if they took up arms, if they committed some crimes, then there's a separate case. So, yes, I wanted to bring that up because at the court hearing on liquidation of Memorial, you were the only person who was addressed by name by the prosecutor because you called Mr. Kuznetsov a terrorist, and because the Memorial database, which is not only your area of responsibility, mentions Lithuanian, Estonian, Latvian, Ukrainian freedom fighters who were classified by the Soviet and Russian prosecutors as nationalists, collaborationists, Nazis, etc., etc. So, how shall we go about it? What shall we do about it in this beautiful Russia of the future when, in addition to the key law on rehabilitation of 1991, when we'll have probably some new laws and regulations on rehabilitation, maybe there will be some clarifications. What shall we do about those people who were against the Soviet Union because they were fighting for the sovereignty of their respective countries? They were fighting against the Soviet state and probably with weapons in their arms. How shall we treat such people in terms of ethics, in terms of returning the names, organizers? How shall we view them? Talking about an ideal setup for paying tribute to those people who fell victims, were repressed in connection with their active fight against the Soviet authority. Yes, we need to state what is a Soviet state. It's a totalitarian, anti-humanistic regime, and it must be condemned in the same vein as the Nazi regime. Just like that, because it was based on anti-humanistic principles. It tried to forcefully change human nature. All this fight against private property, it's pushing by force, it's changing people by force. It's a long conversation on the core principles of the Soviet state, Soviet regime, but it's an abnormal country, it's a criminal country. So when we look at it this way, it would make it easier for us to sort out other things, because if we take a conciliatory view of the Soviet regime, it's fine here, not fine there. No, it's absurd. So in this case, we can clearly state that any forms of national resistance, insubordination, disobedience, active, passive, against the Soviet regime, that was a natural expression of people's fight for freedom. And we understand clearly that memorials database should include all political victims, irrespective of the extent of their rehabilitation. What I mean is that we have, some people have been partially rehabilitated, that those charges were dropped, those remain. All of them are victims of the regime, but each and every of them carries his personal guilt or innocence, because a person who took up arms and who were killing Soviet activists, he is responsible for violent crimes he committed, but not for political reasons. When we mix policy, then it leads to pinning labels on people. This person is clearly he's a collaborationist. So the controversy that erupted had something to do with the fact that some people were found on the database who fought with the Nazis during World War II. But before the war, they had been sentenced and they were rehabilitated based on those sentences, what he did and what they did after they were released from prison. It's a different story, but those people didn't end up on the database because of that, because of the second part of their life. So it appears that we acknowledge, when we put a person on the database, that we acknowledge him on that he was a good person for the rest of his life. That's absurd. Also, what about people who were rehabilitated in their republics in Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania? Do we respect the decisions of the national courts or no? Or do we dissent to such an extent with those countries that we cannot tolerate the decisions of their courts? It's a core issue and we need to give it a thought, but I would take it in the following way. If in their respective countries they've been rehabilitated, then for Memorial, who respects international law and who respects the Constitution of Russia, which states the primacy of international law over the national laws of Russia, we must respect those decisions. When we talk about the repression database, it is not glorification of the people on the database. It's just stating the fact. He was subjected to prosecution, then he was rehabilitated. And this database should include everybody. When the person looks at the elements of the crime, looks at the charges brought against the person, it would become clear why the person was charged, why he was sentenced. Well, if we're talking about full database, an ideal, a dream database, then each organizer of the returning the names project, every participant can make up his or her mind that, okay, I'm going to read this name because he did not commit such crimes, but I don't want to read those names because he did this and this. Yes, yes. For example, somebody picks up a card. If he's a party member, no, I'm not going to read out his name. We also talked about the crimes of totalitarian state against its own citizens, as well as imperialistic crimes against nationals of neighboring or distant countries. And in this regard, I would like to ask you, what's your take? And I would like, and also what I think about it as well. How can we frame this returning the names project in 2022 when we have new victims, when we have a new catastrophe unfolding right in front of our eyes, and people in 2022 people are being put at risk and their lives are being put at risk, and now we're recalling those people who lived 90 years ago, and there's nothing we can do for them and for their children. So what do you think? how shall we look at returning the names project in this context? Well, I think the project itself, which has a long-standing tradition, I think this project has found, just like water, has found its way to the people, and water, ends up trickling down to the world ocean. Those people who read the names from the list of repressed people, sometimes they would add the names of their relatives. uh, they would add some aspects that they concern them. Uh, for example, people would add the name of Yuri Dmitriev. So this project was closely linked to the contemporary life, because all of us has a free will, and in this context, the day-to-day events also fit into this, because yesterday's violations uh, of rights, they have not been worked through, and they led to these horrible events of today. So returning of the names link future, the past and present. Had the Russian Federation after 1991 overcome the past, worked through the past, had Russia uh, lay down foundations for the viability of law-governed state, there would have been no need to fight for human rights to the extent we're doing it now. Of course, each state has a tendency to encroach on people's rights, but such horrendous violations of rights, such horrendous violence against rule of law, the idea of freedom, we haven't experienced it anywhere else. And it's all linked very closely to what we're seeing today. It seems that returning the names is a way to talk about values, and if we agree with the people that people could not be murdered in 1937, we can agree that people cannot be murdered today. Yes, clearly, the main sense of this project is the value of human life, the sanctity of human life, because a state that deprives people of their lives very easily for political reasons, such a state may not exist, doesn't have reason to exist. And if other states inherit such practices, develop them, justify them, they have no right to be called civilized states, and they have no right to existence.